The message came on a Tuesday morning, and it changed everything's satellites around. Earth detected the signal first, and within minutes, every government on the planet received the same transmission in every known human language, and somehow in languages that had been dead for centuries. The Galactic Tribunal had found humanity. David Park was drinking coffee in his small apartment in San Diego when his phone rang, and he almost did not answer it because he was tired and old and had spent the previous night teaching chess to a group of veterans at the community center, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end belonged to someone from the Department of Defense, and within 2 hours, David found himself on a military jet heading to Washington, D.C. without any explanation. He was 62 years old with gray hair and bad knees, and he had not worn his Navy uniform in 15 years. But here he was being escorted through the Pentagon, like the world depended on him. Because it did. The Secretary General of the United Nations sat at the head of a long table surrounded by generals and scientists and people in expensive suits who looked like they had not slept in days. David sat down in the only empty chair and waited. The Secretary General, whose name was Robert Hayes, looked at David with exhausted eyes and said something that made no sense at first. "We need you to play a game." David blinked and asked what kind of game. The screen behind Hayes lit up and showed an image of something that hurt to look at directly because it kept shifting and changing like it could not decide what shape it wanted to be. "This is called Viocalath," Hayes said, and it is apparently the most complex strategic game in the known galaxy, and the Tribunal has used it to conquer 12 different species over the past 10,000 years. David stared at the shifting image and felt a headache forming behind his eyes. "They send a message to new species," Hayes continued, "and that the Bay message is simple, and send a champion to play Viocalath or face immediate subjugation, and every species that has tried to play has lost, and their entire civilization has been absorbed into the Tribunal. And you want me to play?" David said slowly. Hayes nodded. "Why me?" David asked. "Because I am a retired naval commander who runs a chess club, and I am not a genius or a prodigy, and I barely passed my mathematics classes in college." "That is exactly why we chose you," Hayes said. A woman at the table spoke up, and her name was Dr. Lisa Chun, and she was apparently a psychologist who had been studying the Tribunal transmission. "We ran psychological profiles on over 10,000 candidates," she said, "and we were looking for specific traits and not intelligence exactly, but something else. And we found that you, Commander Park, have an unusual relationship with complexity." David raised an eyebrow and asked what that meant. Dr. Chun pulled up another screen showing graphs and charts that meant nothing to David. Most people, when faced with extreme complexity, either try to master every detail or they become overwhelmed and shut down, she explained. But you do something different, and when you encounter unnecessary complexity, you simply ignore it and you cut through to the core of the problem. David thought about this for a moment and then shrugged. "I just find complicated things boring," he said, "and if something can be made simple, I make it simple. That is precisely what we need," Hayes said. "And every other species sent their greatest minds to play Viocalath, and those minds tried to learn all 847 rules and understand every shifting variable and predict every possible outcome, and they went insane, and some literally, and some just strategically, but they all lost. And you think I will win because I will not try to understand it?" David asked. "We think you have the best chance," Hayes admitted, and which is not the same as saying you will win, but you are our best option. David looked around the room at all the powerful and important people staring at him with desperate hope in their eyes, and he thought about his quiet life and his chess club and his small apartment with the nice view of the harbor. "How long do I have?" he asked. 46 hours, Hayes said. David nodded slowly and then asked the question that mattered most to him. "Do I at least get to sit down while I play?" The journey to the Tribunal station took 18 hours in a ship that humans had not built and did not understand, and David spent most of that time sleeping because he had learned long ago that rest was more valuable than preparation when you could not prepare for something. A young diplomat named Grace Kim accompanied him, and she was smart and fierce and had spent 3 years learning Galactic Common, which was apparently the standard language used by all species in the tribunal. She tried to brief David on what to expect, but he held up a hand and stopped her. "Tell me one thing," he said. "And what do they actually want?" Grace paused and thought about this. "They want to win," she said finally, "and they want to prove that they are superior. And the game is not just a game to them, it is a demonstration of dominance." "Then they have already lost," David said, "and because anyone who needs to prove they are superior is not actually sure of it." Grace stared at him and then laughed for the first time since this whole situation began. The tribunal station appeared in the viewport, and it was massive and beautiful and terrifying all at once, and towers of crystal rose from a central structure that looked like it had been grown rather than built, and ships of all sizes moved around it like fish around a reef. David looked at it and felt very small and very human and very far from home. But he also felt something else, and it was a feeling he had not experienced in a long time. And it was the feeling of being exactly where he was supposed to be, you know, Grace said quietly. "And 12 civilizations have sent their champions here, and none of them came back victorious." David nodded and kept watching the station grow larger in the viewport. "I know," he said. "Are you afraid?" she asked. David considered the question seriously, because he believed in being honest with himself. "Yes," he admitted, but I'm also curious, and that is stronger than the fear right now." "Curious about what?" "Curious about what kind of game requires 847 rules," David said, "and curious about what they are really testing, and curious about whether anyone has ever just asked them why." Grace did not have an answer for that. The ship docked, and David Park stepped onto an alien station to play a game he did not understand for stakes he could barely comprehend, and he carried with him only a small bag containing a change of clothes and a worn wooden chess set that had belonged to his grandfather. He did not know if he would win, and he did not know if humanity would survive, and he did not know if he would ever see Earth again, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was going to ask some very simple questions, and he was going to see what happened when he did. The inside of the tribunal station was nothing like David had expected, and everything like a fever dream. The walls seemed to breathe and shift colors based on who was looking at them, and the floors were made of something that felt like glass but moved slightly under each step, like the surface of water frozen at the exact moment of a ripple. Grace walked beside David, and her face was carefully neutral, but he could see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes kept darting to every shadow and corner. They were met by a creature that resembled a tall, thin humanoid made entirely of pale blue light, and introduced itself as the guide and said it would escort them to their quarters. David followed the guide through corridors that twisted in ways that should not have been possible, and past windows that show views of space, and then views of forests, and then views of what looked like the inside of a star. "The windows real?" David asked. The guide turned and looked at him with eyes that had no pupils. "All things are real," the guide said, "and some things are simply more real than others." David decided not to ask any more questions about the windows. Their quarters were surprisingly normal, and there was a bed that looked like a bed, and a table that looked like a table, and chairs that looked like chairs. And David wondered if this was on purpose, or if the tribunal simply could not imagine any other way for guests to live. "You will rest now," the guide said, "and tomorrow you will meet the tribunal, and then you will play." "What time tomorrow?" David asked. The guide made a sound that might have been confusion time. The guide repeated, "And time is a human concept, and we will send for you when it is appropriate." And then the guide faded away like morning fog under sunlight. Grace let out a breath. She had been holding and sat down heavily in one of the chairs. "I have been studying them for 3 years," she said, "and I thought I was prepared. but I was not prepared, nobody. Could be, David said, and he sat down across from her and pulled out his chess set and began setting up the pieces. What are you doing? Grace asked. Thinking, David said. By playing chess, David moved a white pawn forward 2 squares and then moved a black. Pawn to me to chess is simple, he said, and 64 squares and 32 pieces and rules you can learn in an afternoon. But people have been playing it for 1,500 years, and we still have not figured out every secret it holds. He moved another piece and then another, and playing a game against himself, the tribunal thinks complexity is strength, he continued, and they think that more rules means more intelligence and that confusion means power, and they have been playing this game for 10,000 years and adding new rules every time someone finds a way to win. Grace watched him play, and her eyes followed the pieces as they moved across the board. So, what is your strategy? She asked. David smiled, and it was a tired smile, but also a genuine one. My strategy is to not have a strategy, he said, and my strategy is to see the game for what it actually is, and not for what they want me to think it is. That sounds like madness, Grace said. Maybe David admitted him, but so does trying to memorize 847 rules in one night. He captured his own queen with a knight and stared at the board. The tribunal has beaten 12 species, he said slowly, and 12 different kinds of minds and 12 different approaches to problem solving, and they have won every single time, so they are unbeatable. Grace said. No, David shook his head, and they have beaten everyone who played their game. And that is different from being unbeatable. Grace leaned forward and her eyes narrowed. What do you mean? David picked up his king and held it up to the light. Every species that came here tried to master Vioa Caliph, he said, and they studied every rule and memorized every variable and tried to become perfect players of the tribunal game. And they lost. Grace said. They lost. David agreed. And because you cannot beat someone at their own game when they have been playing it for 10,000 years, and when they made the rules, and when they can change the rules whenever they want. So what do you do instead? David set the king back down in the center of the board. You play a different game, he said, and one they do not expect, and one they do not know, and one where their 10,000 years of experience means nothing. Grace was quiet for a long moment, and then she laughed, and it was a strange sound in this strange place, but it was also human and real, and David found comfort in it. You are either a genius or completely insane, she said. Probably both, David admitted, but I am also the only option, humanity. As so we will find out together. He packed away the chess set and lay down on the bed and closed his eyes. Get some sleep, Grace, he said, and tomorrow we meet the tribunal, and I want to see what they look like when someone asks them a stupid question. Grace did not sleep that night, and she sat by the window that showed impossible views and watched the stars move in patterns that made no sense, and she thought about Earth and about everyone waiting to find out if they would be free or conquered. She thought about David Park and his simple chess set and his tired eyes and his absolute refusal to be impressed by complexity, and she wondered if maybe that was exactly what humanity needed. Not a genius who could match the tribunal thought for thought, but a man who looked at impossible problems and asked why they had to be impossible in the first place. The guide appeared at what felt like morning, but was probably not, and escorted them through more impossible corridors to a chamber that was larger than any space David had ever seen. The tribunal waited for them. 12 beings sat in a semicircle, and each one was different, and each one was ancient, and each one had once been the champion of their species before they were absorbed into the collective. And at the center sat High Arbiter Vex, and it looked like a mantis made of black stone, and its eyes reflected light in ways that made David feel like he was looking into forever. You are the human, Vex said, and its voice sounded like wind through dead leaves. I am, David confirmed. You are small, David shrugged and said. Everyone is small compared to something. Vex made a sound that might have been approval or might have been disgust, and it was impossible to tell. Tomorrow you will play, Vex announced. And tonight you will be given the rules and all 847 of them. And you may request time to study and most species. As for years, and we are patient, how long do most species take? David asked. Longest was 47 years, Vex said, and the shortest was 3 months. And what do you request? David looked at the ancient beings before him, and at the impossible chamber around him, and at the weight of 12 conquered civilizations pressing down on this moment. I will read them tonight, he said. And we play tomorrow. The tribunal went silent, and David felt every eye in the room focus on him with new intensity. Vex leaned forward, and its obsidian body creaked like old wood. You are either very brave or very foolish, Vex said. David smiled and answered, with complete honesty, I am very tired, and I want to go home, and the fastest way to do that is to play your game and win. For the first time in centuries, Vex did not know what to say. The rule book appeared in their quarters as a holographic display that filled half the room with glowing text and symbols and diagrams that moved and shifted and occasionally screamed for reasons David did not want to understand. Grace stared it with wide eyes, and her diplomatic training completely failing to hide her horror. There are more rules than I expected, she whispered. David walked around the display slowly and looked at it from different angles and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Rule 1, he read aloud, and the board exists in 7 simultaneous dimensional states, and players must track all states at all times or forfeit by confusion. He moved to the next section. Rule 47, and pieces may evolve based on the emotional state of the opposing player, as measured by the tribunal biometric scanners. And the next rule 212, and every third turn the board will shift its fundamental geometry, and players who fail to adapt within 8 seconds will lose 1 piece of the tribunal. Choosing Grace had pulled out a tablet and was frantically taking notes and trying to organize the information into something manageable. This is impossible, she said, and no human mind could process all of this. And not in one night, and not in 1 year, and maybe not ever. David stopped walking and stood in the center of the holographic display and let the rules wash over him like water. You, all right? He said calmly. Grace looked up from her tablet. What do you mean? I am right, and you are just giving up. No, David said, and I mean you are right that no human mind could master all of this, and which means mastering it is not the path to victory. Reached out and touched one of the floating rule displays, and it flickered under his fingers. Grace, I spent 30 years teaching strategy to naval officers and pilots in Marines. And do you know what the hardest thing to teach was? Grace shook her head. The hardest thing, David continued, was getting them to see what was actually there instead of what they expected to see. And we are pattern-seeking creatures, and we see complexity, and we assume it must all be important, and we assume every detail matters. He pulled up Rule 1 again and read it carefully. The board exists in 7-dimensional states, he repeated. And why what? Grace asked. Why 7? David said, and why not 6 or 8 or 12? And what is special about 7? And who decided that? And what happens if I just ignore 6 of them? You cannot ignore them, Grace protested, and the rules clearly state the players must track all states. And what happens if I do not? David asked. Grace opened her mouth to answer and then closed it again because she realized she did not know. The rulebook says forfeit by confusion, she said finally, but it does not define what confusion means or how it is measured. David smiled and moved to another rule. Pieces evolve based on emotional state, he read, and which means they want me to feel things, and they want me to be stressed and afraid and overwhelmed, and they have built an entire game around producing those emotions in their opponents. He pulled up more rules and scanned through them quickly. Rule 73, and points are awarded for elegant play as judged by the tribunal, and Rule 144, and players may petition for rule clarification, but each petition costs them 1 turn, and Rule 308, and the game ends when one player achieves VO or Calith Prime. capture, or when one player concedes, or when the tribunal declares a winner by majority assessment. Grace was following along now, and her eyes were narrowing as she began to see what David was seeing. They are not just testing strategy, she said slowly, and they are testing psychology, and they want their opponents to break. David nodded and kept reading Rule 412. He said, and victory is achieved when a player places any piece in direct contact with the opposing verticalis prime, while that prime is unable to move to any adjacent space in any dimensional state. Read it again, and then a third time. That is it, he said quietly. What is it? Grace asked. The actual win condition, David said, and everything else is decoration and distraction and noise. But this rule right here tells us what actually matters and capture the enemy prime when it cannot escape, like checkmate. Grace said, exactly, like checkmate, David confirmed, and they have buried the simple truth under 846 other rules, but at its core, this is just chess with extra steps. He turned off the holographic display, and the room suddenly felt much larger and much quieter. Grace stared at the empty space where all those rules had been floating. What are you going to do? She asked. I am going to sleep. David said. You are going to sleep, Grace repeated, and the game is tomorrow, and you have not memorized anything. David pulled his chess set out of his bag and set it on the table. I have memorized the only thing that matters, he said. And I know what the goal is, and I know that they want me to be confused, and I know that they have never faced an opponent who refused to be confused. He set up the pieces slowly and carefully, and with the same motions he had used 10,000 times. Before they expect me to drown in their complexity, he said, and they expect me to beg for more time, and they expect me to show up tomorrow with my head full of rules and my heart full of fear. And instead, Grace said, and instead, David said, and I am going to show up with a clear mind and a simple question. Grace sat down across from him and looked at the chessboard. What question? David moved his pawn forward, and the same opening move he had made in countless games against countless opponents. I'm going to ask them if this is chess. Grace laughed, and it was a surprise sound, and then she stopped laughing because she saw that David was completely serious. You think that will work, she said. I think, David said carefully, and that no one has ever asked them that question, and I think they have been waiting 10,000 years for someone to see through all their complexity. And I think they might not know what to do when someone finally does, or they might crush you immediately. Grace said. They might, David agreed. But I would rather lose in 5 minutes being myself than lose in 5 hours pretending to be something I am not. Captured her imaginary pawn with his own, and smiled now. Help me practice, and you play black, and I will play white, and we will see if I remember how to win at something simple before I try to win at something impossible. They played chess until the guide appeared to take them to the arena. David won every game, not because he was brilliant, but because he never forgot what the goal was, and he never let himself be distracted by anything that did not serve that goal. Tomorrow, he would find out if the same approach would work against an empire that had conquered 12 worlds. He suspected it would. The arena was designed to break minds before the game even started. David understood this the moment he stepped through the entrance and saw what waited for him, and he almost laughed because it was so obvious and so desperate. The ceiling stretched upward into infinity, or at least the illusion of infinity, and lights moved through it like living things, and sounds echoed from directions that should not exist, and the floor beneath his feet hummed with a frequency that made his teeth ache. Thousands of observers filled the galleries, and some were physical beings, and some were projections, and some were things David could not identify and did not want to identify. At the center of everything floated the verticalis board. It was beautiful in the way a hurricane is beautiful and terrible in the way a nightmare is terrible, and it shifted and changed and pulsed with colors that had no names in any human language. Pieces moved across its surface without anyone touching them, and the board itself seemed to breathe and expand and contract like a living thing. Grace walked beside David, and her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "Are you ready?" she asked David. Looked at the board, and then at the galleries, and then at the 12 ancient beings of the tribunal watching from their elevated platform. "No," he said honestly, but I never was, and I never would be, and so it does not matter." He walked to his designated position and sat down in the chair that adjusted itself to his body in ways that felt slightly wrong. High Arbiter Vex descended from the platform and took its position across from David, and its obsidian form seemed to absorb the light around it. "Human," Vex said, "and you have had one night to prepare, and most who rush to play regret their haste." David looked at Vex calmly. "I spent one night not preparing," he said, "and that was the preparation." Vex made a sound that might have been interest. "Explain." David gestured at the board between them. "You gave me 847 rules," he said, "and 847 ways to lose, and 847 things to worry about, and 847 reasons to be afraid." "Yes," Vex agreed, "and that is Var Kalethno," David said, "and that is a test, and the rules are not the game, and the rules are the first challenge, and you want to see if I will drown in them." Before we even begin, the galleries went quiet, and David felt thousands of eyes focusing on him with new intensity. Vex leaned forward, and its ancient eyes reflected David like dark mirrors. No one has ever said that, Vex admitted, and in 10,000 years no one has ever named what Var Kaleth truly is. David shrugged. "Maybe no one ever asked the right questions." The board activated fully, and pieces materialized in starting positions, and the dimensional layers flickered into existence, and probability fields shimmered around every piece like heat waves. Vex made the first move. It was a complex sequence involving 4 pieces across 3-dimensional states, and it triggered a cascade of secondary effects and board modifications and piece evolutions that David could not begin to follow. The galleries murmured with appreciation, and David heard words like elegant and masterful and devastating. He looked at the board. He looked at all the shifting complexity and all the moving parts and all the things designed to overwhelm and confuse and terrify. And then he asked his question, "Is this chess?" The murmuring stopped. Vex froze. The entire arena seemed to hold its breath. "I do not understand," Vex said slowly. "Chess," David repeated, "and 2 players and 2 armies and 2 kings, and the goal is to trap the enemy king so it cannot escape, and everything else is just pieces and positions and tactics." Pointed at the center of his formation, where a crystalline construct pulsed with inner light. "That is my king," he said. He pointed at an identical construct on Vex's side. "That is your king." He looked at all the other pieces, and all the dimensional states, and all the probability fields. "Everything else," he said, "is just decoration." Vex stared at David for a long moment, and then made a sound that David had never heard before, and it was something between a laugh and a cry and a whisper. "You cannot reduce Var Kaleth to something so simple," Vex said. David picked up one of his pieces and moved it forward, and 1 square, and 1 dimension, and 1 simple direct movement toward the center of the board. "I just did," he said. The piece landed, and nothing happened, and no cascade of effects, and no dimensional shifts, and no dramatic consequences. Just a piece in a new position, and slightly closer to the enemy king. "Your turn," David said. Vex responded with another complex sequence, and another brilliant combination, and another masterwork of strategic thinking that had taken centuries to develop. David watched it happen, and then he moved another piece forward, simple and direct and obvious. The galleries began to murmur again, and this time the words were different and confused and impossible and unprecedented. An hour passed. David moved his pieces like he was playing chess, and always forward, and always simple, and always focused on one goal, and getting closer to the enemy king. Vex played Var Kaleth at its highest level, and every move was a work of art, and every combination was a testament to 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom. But something strange was happening. The probability fields that were supposed to predict David moves kept failing, and they were designed to analyze complex strategies and counter sophisticated plans. But David had no complex strategies. And he had no sophisticated plans, he just moved his pieces forward. The psychological scanners that were supposed to measure his emotional state and evolve his pieces against him kept returning confused readings, and David was not afraid, and he was not stressed, and he was not overwhelmed. He was just playing chess. The dimensional shifts that were supposed to disorient him and force him to constantly readjust kept failing to matter because David only tracked one dimension, and the one where his king and Vex King existed. He ignored everything else. 2 hours passed. Vex began to make mistakes, small ones at first, and a piece slightly out of position, and a combination that did not quite connect, and a defensive line with an unexpected gap. The ancient being had never faced an opponent like this, and it had never played against someone who simply refused to engage with the complexity it had spent millennia mastering. All of its experience and all of its knowledge and all of its carefully developed strategies were designed to counter sophisticated play. They had no answer for simplicity. David moved another piece forward, and for the first time Vex did not have an immediate response. The High Arbiter stared at the board and at the simple, direct path David had carved through all the beautiful complexity. "This is not how the game is played," Vex said, and there was something in its voice that David had not heard before. Fear. David looked at Vex and felt something unexpected. Compassion. "You have been playing alone for so long," he said quietly, "and so long that you forgot what the game was actually about, and you kept adding rules and complexity and beauty, but you lost sight of the simple truth underneath." "And what is that truth?" Vex asked. David moved his piece into position, and it was a move that any chess player would recognize, and it was a move that threatened the enemy king directly and left no room for escape. "The truth," David said, "is that games are supposed to be fun, and winning is supposed to feel good, and somewhere along the way you turned Var Kalath into a prison for yourself, and everyone you conquered." Vex looked at the board, and then at David, and then at the 12 ancient beings watching from above, and then for the first time in 300 years, High Arbiter Vex did not know what to do next. 3 hours into the game, and the arena had transformed, not physically, and the walls were still impossible, and the ceiling still stretched into false infinity, and the galleries still held thousands of watching beings. But something had changed in the air itself, and in the way everyone was watching, and in the silence that had replaced the murmuring. David moved his pieces, and one after another, and each move simple, and each move direct, and each move bringing him closer to the enemy king. Vex responded with increasingly desperate complexity and combinations that triggered dozens of secondary effects and dimensional shifts that rewrote the board in spectacular ways, and probability cascades that should have trapped David pieces in impossible positions. But David just kept moving forward, because he was not playing Var Kalath, was playing chess, and in chess you do not need to understand everything. You just need to understand one thing, and how to trap the king. The tribunal members had descended from their platform, and they stood at the edge of the arena now, and their ancient faces showed emotions that David could not read, but suspected were close to shock. One of them, and a being that looked like a living crystal formation, spoke to Vex in a language David did not understand. Vex responded sharply and dismissively, and returned its attention to the board. But David saw the way its obsidian hands trembled slightly as it made its next move. "You are afraid," David said. It was not a question. Vex did not deny. "I'd have played this game for 300 years, the High Arbiter said, and I have never lost, and I have crushed champions from 12 different worlds, and I have become the greatest Var Kalath player in the history of the Tribunal Land." Now David said, and now Vex continued, "And you are sitting across from me with your simple little moves and your simple little questions, and you are winning." Words seemed to cost Vex something to say. David looked at the board and at the position he had built, and at the trap that was slowly closing around the enemy king. I am not winning because I am smarter than you, he said. And I am winning because I am playing a different game. Vex made a sound that was almost a laugh. You are playing a game that does not exist, the High Arbiter said. And there is no chess here, and there is only VO Caliph. David shook his head. There is always chess, he said. And there is always chess beneath every game of strategy and every battle and every competition. And two sides and two goals and two kings, and everything else is just details. He moved his piece, and it was a knight in his mind, and it jumped over the complexity and landed in the one square that mattered. Your king cannot escape, David said. Vex stared at the board. The tribunal members pushed closer. The galleries erupted in sounds that David could not interpret, and might have been cheering, and might have been screaming, and might have been something else entirely. Check, David said. Vex had one move left, and one desperate gamble, and one final chance to use all the complexity of Vio Caliph to escape the simple trap. The High Arbiter raised its obsidian hand and hesitated. You could move your king, David said, and you could trigger the dimensional shift in Rule 234, and you could evacuate to the 7th layer, and you could buy yourself 3 more turns. Vex looked at David with something like wonder. You read the rules after Ali. Read Rule 412, David said, and the one that tells you how to win, and I read enough of the others to know what you might try to don't. Yet you are telling me how to escape. David smiled, and it was tired and honest and human, because it will not matter, he said, and wherever you move, and whichever dimension you flee to, and however many turns you buy, and I will follow, and I will keep moving forward, and I will ask the same simple question until there is nowhere left for you to go. Vex lowered its hand. Why did you come here? The High Arbiter asked. And why did you agree to play? And you could have refused, and you could have fought, and your species could have chosen war. We could have. David agreed. But war would have killed millions and maybe billions, and I am one person. And if one person could save all those lives by sitting down and playing a game, then one person should try. You risked everything. Vex said. I risked myself, David corrected, and that is different, and that is my choice to make. The arena was silent now, and completely silent. And the kind of silence that happens when something important is about to change. Vex looked at David, and then at the board, and then at the tribunal members, and then back at David. No one has ever asked us why, Vex said quietly. Why we play, Vex said, and why we conquer, and why we built this game, and why we have spent 10,000 years collecting species like trophies. The bestie High Arbiter reached out and touched the Vio Caliph Prime and the king and its own king that had nowhere left to go. We were alone once, Vex said, and we were the first intelligent species in our region of the galaxy. And we searched for others, and we found them, and we did not know how to talk to them. And we did not know how to connect, and so we made a game. A game, David repeated. A game, Vex confirmed, and a way to meet, and a way to compete, and a way to find common ground. But somewhere we lost sight of that, and the game became about winning, and winning became about dominance, and dominance became about fear. Vex pushed its king forward, and into David waiting peace, and into defeat. I concede, Vex said. The galleries exploded with sound, and David could not tell if it was celebration or chaos, and it did not matter. Grace was suddenly beside him, and her arms were around him, and she was laughing and crying at the same time. You won, she said, and you actually won. David hugged her back and felt the exhaustion of the past 3 days finally catching up with him. I asked a question, he said, and they finally answered it. The tribunal members approached, and David stood to meet them, and he expected anger or resentment or demands for a rematch. Instead, the crystal being spoke, and its voice was like wind chimes in a storm. You have won, the crystal being said. And according to our laws, and your species will not be subjugated. But we would ask something of you. David waited. Teach us, the crystal being said, and teach us to play your chess, and teach us to find the simple truth beneath our own complexity. And we have been lost for so long, and we have forgotten why we started playing in the first place. David looked at Grace, and then at Vex, and then at the impossible arena around him. He reached into his bag and pulled out his worn wooden chess set, and the one his grandfather had given him, and the one he had carried across the galaxy. "I can do that," he said 6 months later, and David Park sat in a garden on the tribunal station, and the garden had real plants now and real sunlight piped in from a nearby star and real chairs that did not adjust themselves in uncomfortable ways. Across from him sat High Arbiter Vex, and the board between them was simple and 64 squares and 32 pieces. Vex moved a pawn and then looked up at David. "Is this chess?" Vex asked. David smiled and moved his own pawn. "Yes," he said, "and it always was." They played until the artificial sunset, and they did not keep score, and they did not play to conquer or dominate. They just played, and somewhere in the galaxy and on a small blue planet, and millions of humans went about their lives without knowing how close they had come to losing everything. And they owed it all to a tired old man who had looked at impossible complexity and asked a simple question: is this chess? The answer had changed everything. The answer had been yes, and yes was enough.